Hey everyone, I'm Paul Muller, the host of the AI Forecast podcast, a weekly podcast sponsored by Cloudera, where we explore the past, present, and future of data and AI in the enterprise, along with leading companies and industry experts from around the planet. Well, as AI booms and workloads skyrocket, data centers are being pushed to their physical and operational limits. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. Energy consumption, I should say, and cost continues to be a concern when it comes to the economic as well as the environmental sustainability of AI compute. Let's put some data behind that. A recent report estimates that data center electricity consumption is going to grow by an average of 23% annually. That's a staggering number between 23 and 2028. The same report forecasts that AI-specific energy usage will increase by an average of 43% during the same period. I've got personal experience with this. We recently deployed an AI powered server at one of the businesses that I am a director of, and energy consumption went up 10x over previous traditional workloads, a staggering number. So look, even if you don't care about the environmental impact, and shame on you if you don't, I'm just kidding, but the energy costs associated with AI may limit its growth before Moore's law comes and slows things down. So to talk about this emerging challenge and to offer his advice on the steps that you can take to get ahead of the AI energy curve, we're joined by Scott Jarnagin, who's the CEO and founder of global advisory firm Caddis Cloud, one of the industry's leading authorities on data center development. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
Thank you, Paul. Nice to meet you. Excited to be here.
It's great to have you. Where do we find you today?
I am in Seattle, Washington today. I'm here for a meeting, and then I'll be back heading back home to Dallas.
Dallas is home, is it? Okay, perfect. Well, one of the centers of course, Texas, one of the centers of the world's energy think tanks in terms of how we think about the production and consumption of energy. We're going to get to that in a second. Before we do, we like to play a little game at the beginning of the show. We call the Fast Four, the Furious Four, the lightning round, call it what you will. Chance to limber up, guess to get to know you through a slightly different lens. You ready to play the game?
Let's do it.
All right, perfect. First up, what would people who know you best say is your superpower, Scott?
Oh, geez. It would be, I would say, partnerships and building my partnerships of my trusted network.
The most impactful technology of all time?
So many out there. I'm going to say the aqueduct. The use and transportation of potable water for expansion, healthcare, impactful to everything. Yeah.
Deep cut. That's going back some time there. All right. So, have you ever been to Rome or some of the countries that?
I have. I've seen it. It's amazing, right? It's amazing what they did for water transportation and how it allowed expansion, agriculture, health issues, you name it.
And not a power tool in sight. That's the thing that keeps blowing my mind, right? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
It's just amazing. No automation. All right. Next up. Speaking of automation, we all talk about AI and what it can do for businesses. But what would you like to see AI do for you in your life personally?
Besides make my bed, get up and just automate the making of my bed.
That is an acceptable answer if you want to go with it.
No, yeah, let's go for it. Yeah, make my bed in the morning. Just get when it's done. Something super simple.
You know what? It'd be great if we could. I think people would buy that, like a Roomba for your bedroom.
There you go. Yeah.
All right, last question. Each of us, I think, has a secret kind of, we'll call it superpower or a set of hacks that we use to help us get the most out of data. Mm-hmm. What are some of the best practices or hacks you've learned as someone working with data on a daily basis?
Outside of maintaining security, as always, is your data hygiene. Yeah. Data hygiene and cleanliness of your data. It's only as good as how clean your data is. So if there's holes and dirty data, then your modeling or tools or whatever you have is just not going to work properly. So data hygiene.
Well, let's jump into it. We're going to talk a bit about the changing nature of data centers in the world of AI. And it's fair to say you're no armchair quarterback when it comes to data center design. Take us through your background.
So I would say for the past 25 plus years, been involved in construction and infrastructure globally with opportunities to work at Microsoft building their retail brick and mortar platform. Recruited to Oracle to develop their data center fit out team plus their site selection team globally. Had a fantastic time doing that. Really focused on obviously global expansion. Working with Oracle when they came on, there were 2 regions built, and we expanded about 44 markets around the world. Today at Caddis, we focus on a number of different verticals. Really focused on Power development, we're doing direct power generation for industrial landlocked ports. That's something outside of the data center space, and we have opportunity. We'll bring data centers to that market. Doing land development with a number of partners. We're focused on power generation, behind the meter power generation, interactions and interconnections back to the grid where we can, understanding what that impact is, doing land development and power master planning of sites for obviously the use of data center space where we can, and really focused on power and data center as an anchor with potential tech park and training and trade, mixed use opportunities for additional economic development in markets where they might be reduced. And we focus on construction management as well, procurement and construction management for data centers, and for working with other developers and data center operators where we can.
Wow, so you literally put the hard in hardware. Like, it doesn't get much more real than that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about the changing face of data center strategy. And, you know, it's for me personally, it's been interesting to watch the ebb and flow of that, because I can remember a time 30 plus years ago when data centers were hot and were big business. And it seemed that I suppose it was probably the introduction of client server technology and a lot of smaller compute meant that people started, you know, you used to need a football field sized room for a mainframe. People started shoving stuff under their desks or in a cupboard as things got smaller and more power efficient. It seems now data centers are front page news again. What's going on inside the data center? How would you characterize the last 25 years?
An ever-changing dynamic where it seemed like it was stabilized for quite some time, and especially when I was working at Oracle, the specifications that we were building to meet over a number of years scaled a bit when we went from an 8 kilowatt rack to a 10 or 12, 15 kilowatt rack, and the impact to the environment versus where we're at today. We were at GTC a couple of weeks ago, my team and I, and they're introducing or talking about a 600 kilowatt rack, right? Going from 8 kilowatts to 20 kilowatts to 100 to 200 kilowatts, and now talking in late 2027, 2028, whatever it may be, the introduction of a 600 kilowatt solution. So what does that mean, and how do you plan for it? It's a tremendous impact to the space. Yeah,
let's pause on that for a second, because when you talk about a rack, just to help people who maybe have not spent a lot of time inside a data center, what are the physical dimensions of a rack? And you'll need to use both imperial and metric units for our audience.
I don't know if I have
I don't know what a 19-inch rack is in centimeters either. Don't worry about it, mate.
I don't have the total footprint dimensions. I should have off the top of my head because we've done enough of them. But that's it. It takes up each rack will take about a couple of tiles, 24, 48 inches wide. Just depends on the type of rack that you're deploying. Whether it's storage, compute, network, it's going to be dependent on the solution.
Half a megawatt of energy consumption into a space that two people could stand in and it start to feel awkward. Would that be a good way of describing it?
That's an interesting question, because at the end of the day, if I need to see what the actual physical footprint was going to be of a solution of that nature. You'll have your device, your rack, with all your equipment in it, but where do you put your RPDUs and for power distribution? I would assume, because I haven't seen it yet, but I would assume that it'd be a multi-rack solution. Like that 600 kilowatt rack would have to be spread across 2 or 3, 4 different racks because of the amount of power that's going to be pulled there, and your RPDUs and the distribution of that that's also going to feed to your network, to your core components, would have to be something a little more dynamic than just a single one big massive unit.
Understood. We are talking, though, fairly considerable energy density. And, of course, where there's energy consumption, you've got heat, right?
Yes.
And heat's one of the other big problems we've got, is trying to get rid of all of that excess heat as those GPUs are churning away. You've got to ventilate the space. You've got obviously need air conditioning, stabilized air. You've got need clean air, I presume. So it's not just a question of providing electricity and space for these things. You've got to provide an environment that's stable for them. And I presume that creates its own challenges as well, because you need power to power the air conditioning.
It's not a singular solution. When we start looking at the various workloads that are going to impact the space, not every one of those racks will be a high-dense rack, right? So how do you make sure that from your cooling and power distribution, it's managed effectively so you can accommodate those larger workloads that are going to hit, those larger racks, those larger workloads. So when you have your distribution of power and cooling throughout the unit, it's an efficient manner, and you're not melting anything down. If you can imagine a 200 kilowatt rack, if cooling goes out, how fast the solution, it'll literally start melting things fairly quickly. So and I do believe from the environmental standpoint, going to the various trade shows, GTC as one of them, the NVIDIA trade show that happened in San Jose, It's actually incredibly eye-opening. And supercompute that happened in Atlanta in 2024, it's amazing the technology that's coming out to mitigate and accommodate solutions.
So let's talk, how's the data center industry responded and evolved over the last few years to handle what is this exponential rise in computing demands?
It's trying to point at a moving target in terms of what you're trying to do from a physical. So everything we're going to do is from a physical delivery standpoint to accommodate the need of AI. And not every data center operator or provider is focused on AI workloads, because as we talk to the many people around the world, there are elements of AI, of course, and there's going to be from a power consumption. There are other elements that people won't focus on from a total delivery, because there's, I will say, an ignored space. But from the AI delivery standpoint, structurally, architecturally, planning that perspective, point loads for your weights of your floor, not only that, the additional point loads and rack from a structural standpoint for all the additional power distribution and fiber distribution that happens. Then you get into chilled water to the chip or direct chip to chip cooling, how that impacts the space from a mechanical standpoint and additional power standpoint. So there's so many different factors from a physical standpoint that you have to plan for now. And then if you think about throwing in additional rack densities and how that's going to impact your space, how, as a developer, a data center operator, do you plan for something that's changing at such a scale, at such a large pace, fast pace? And that's the biggest challenge that the team is having right now. Anyone that I've talked to that's trying to get in front of the increased workloads.
So how do you plan for the fact that, to your point, where the space does seem to be moving very, very rapidly? How do you accommodate that? What can you do?
Well, I will say your design and planning has to be, you have to understand what you're going to do and what I will say your focus is going to be from the data center, the physical space up front from a design and delivery standpoint. That's going to be key in the factors, because that's going to impact everything you're going to do from a design and build standpoint. And from there, putting the tools and processes and the equipment in place, not delivering everything, building everything to the rack immediately day one, but having the ability to scale when customer demand meets it, right? The impact and the discussions that you have with your client, your end client, are going to be critical. Your client wants something day one, 120 kilowatt day one. Well, what is your forecast and future that you're meeting with? So as a developer, if you're not having those conversations, those deep conversations with your customers, and they may not have all the answers, but they should have a vision, and you can help them get to that vision with what they want to do 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now. Because most of these terms of the contracts that you're signing with these customers, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, there's going to be a large impact, capital expense, plus a physical expense on what that site looks like. So having those deep conversations with your end client is going to be key, building that rapport and trust with your customer to understand what they're doing from a long-term scale perspective is really critical, in my mind, from your upfront planning. Because a lot of people aren't building on spec anymore. They're not building this big shell and building all the things that would accommodate. They're waiting for the customer to start saying, here's what we want to implement, and we're building it to meet that scale and plan for that scale.
So speaking of planning, and again, my history in tech and business goes back 3 decades or more. It was back in the day common for every enterprise to have their own data center. Then they seemed to go through a period of retrenchment as those data centers got smaller, as compute got more efficient. And we've reached a point now where a lot of organizations are just shutting their data centers down and moving to cloud providers or to dedicated data center providers, hosting providers. The move to AI, or sorry, I shouldn't say the move, the trend towards AI has a lot of folks appear to now be doing a lot more compute on premises, on their own, in their own data centers. Are you seeing a shift in the sort of buyers of data center technology? Is it moving back to the enterprise, or is it firmly in the land of the cloud and hosting providers?
It's a combination there, but I think there's still a more of an emphasis on moving things to the cloud, to more of the data center operators, because of the scale in which things are moving. As an enterprise client, unless you truly have the site and space to accommodate, you'll never be able to maintain the change, because it's not your core competency typically from an enterprise standpoint, right? So you're not going to have the big, large space. A lot of people don't want to expend that kind of capital, the monthly expense to maintain something of that nature, or constantly have to update tens of hundreds of millions of dollars of that space over time, right? So I think from a total impact, there's still going to be a large emphasis on moving towards the data center operators, those developers. And I think at the end of the day, it's when we're talking environmental impact, that has a tremendous impact to environment, reduction of carbon, reduction environmental footprint. If you have hundreds of enterprise customers, not really, I'm not saying they're not maintained, but don't maintain with the diligence of a data center operator, their space, power, cooling, waste, everything else, and they're moving to a larger space that has, I'll say, a lot of eyes on what you're doing in that space. It helps control impact to environment.
The Economist recently, I think, had an article about data center site selection. I can't recall if it was related to energy, but that was certainly one of the considerations. And the other is things like cooling and access to, for example, fresh water, which is part of the HVAC or cooling system designed for many data centers. And the issue becomes the scarcity of spaces and places to do these things. It's one of the big drivers, I think, of data center selection. So I'm just curious, as you as an industry are thinking about this at the moment, what's the big bottleneck or the big concern that comes up most? Is it access to power generation facilities? Is it the cooling discussion? Is it space? Is it the neighbors complaining that they don't want a data center? What right now is what are the conversations that keep coming up as a regular constraint as people are thinking about planning their choices?
The biggest challenge is power generation, transmission, stuff, say timing the market, substation, switching station, the step downs that are required to deliver power to a space, working with the utilities and understanding their timelines, developing that partnership with the utilities. If you have behind the meter power generation, how are you going to interconnect back to the grid? Can they receive and accommodate that power back to the grid? Are they even willing to? How does that impact their transmission, right? Their utilities, their infrastructure. So we were recently working with a smaller co-op here in the States, and the biggest challenge was if we were planning to do a potential gigawatt of power behind the meter, so can we interconnect? Well, then at the end of the day, I just don't think they have the ability right now to receive that much power back to the grid, so to speak. And so we'd have to work with them on that aspect, and that's a big challenge. So when you're developing, some of the first questions that we get when we're working with potential teams that might want to buy the site is like, do you have a plan? If you're doing behind the meter, how are you going to, what's that grid connect going to look like? Is it planned? What's the planning around that? So the biggest challenge outside of it is always power generation. Yeah.
The energy discussion's the big one. There you go. And do you get the sense that, I'm just curious as to when you look to the broader market, I don't know how much exposure you've got to the international market, but are those issues similar in, say, places like Europe where maybe space is also a constraint, or do you see sort of consistent issues around the planet?
We're working in areas of Europe. We're working in areas of the Ireland to the Nordics to Malaysia to Singapore into areas of Saudi Arabia. At least my little team's involved in aspects of projects there. And the messaging is always, it's consistent across the globe. Really, it is. It comes down to power generation, obviously water. What are you doing for power? What is your power supply? What's that mixture of power look like? As well as regulatory concerns, actually getting something to market. There's a lot of BYOP, bring your own power to market. So in areas that you can't generate there, that the grid's not able to provide you power, they're like, hey, the government's like, bring your own power. But the challenges with developing your own power and interconnecting with the grid and getting over them, the either permitting and or regulatory hurdles is it takes time, right? It's not a fast overnight, get it done in 9-12 months. It's 24, 36, 48 months to get anything done and to get over those regulatory hurdles, permitting hurdles, to get anything built. And then at the end of the day, because there's so much demand, supply chain is now becoming another major factor in getting gas turbines and everything else. So it just kind of compounds on itself, and you're trying to navigate those issues in each one of these markets for the quickest to the market solution that's the most feasible for data center construction.
All right, so got to ask the question. Let's imagine you're not so much king for a day, but you get to wave a magic wand and design the perfect site. What would a perfect site look like to you for a modern data center? What would it have around it?
It's a really interesting question, because it's myself and a few of my development partners that I do work with. One of the core things that we are really trying to accomplish, when you get into what we call the tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4 markets, where because of potential legislation or job loss that might have been passed, if you're coming into a market and you're discussing power generation, If you combine cycle with gas, it might be steam, you might do hydrogen at some point, you might do nuclear at some point. Those are all possibly new technology that requires pipeline, it requires all this different technology. It might not be normal within that environment, within that market. And then you're going to drop in a data center, 100 megawatts to 500 megawatts to a gigawatt. A lot of technologies, but it might not be normal within that market that you're working in. So when we take a look at these things, and if you're going to anchor power, you're going to anchor a data center, what else is going to be needed in that environment? Mixed use, trade schools, training, schooling opportunities. So when we start stepping into master plan a site, let's say we have 1,000 or 2,000 acres, outside of the data center, outside of the power generation and all the setbacks that you have to make sure noise and abatements, everything else, how else do we make sure that local economy is impacted? Either doing tech schools, trade schools, incubator spaces, so trying to do a master plan, a mixed use project that's going to feed into the data center and all the different technologies there and train either, I'll say, local residents on some of these aspects, and of course bring additional industry there and make sure there's a sustainable market for long-term operations at the data center space, but also something sustainable for small business applications. Like I said, the incubator type space for things. And so when we take a look at those environments, we really try hard to model something that's sustainable, not just for the data center, but additional growth or additional business that would help the data center plus the local residents too. And that all comes down to training and schooling and mixed use and retail and coffee shops. Someday if I'm at a data center, I'll need a sandwich and a coffee. So what is there and available to me in a market that might only have 40, 50, 60,000 people? And with this influx of work, you might have an extra 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people. One of the questions I received on a large parcel, we're working with the state working with one of the states, and their question to us, the governor and one of the state legislators, like, hey, so you're going to do this thing and you drive all this potential work and people. Well, what about homes and housing? How can you help us out with that? So we talked about mixed use opportunities, retail on the bottom, apartments on top, but also going into the local market to help bring development from a housing perspective. And that's always key, right? So if you really step into the economic development teams and the utility teams to understand what that market is and who they are and where you're developing, and build those relationships, you'll find out some of the other challenges that are there that you might be able to help address. And the benefit of that, in my humble opinion, is that you get a lot of local support, regional support, county support, and state support when you're doing something of that nature. Because they're like, okay, you're a true partner that's trying to do something for long-term for our economic development for these regions. And so there are several sites here in the U.S. that we have 1,000 acre plus that we're really trying hard to develop that master plan, that end-to-end.
And which is just staggering to me because I just always assumed that a data center is this sort of faceless big box with a whole bunch of HVAC on the roof or to the side of it. And it's populated by 3 people and no one goes anywhere near it. There's a security guard out the front and it is almost isolated from the community. And what you're saying is that progressive thinking has it really almost as a destination or at least integrated into community. Did I get that right?
I think we should turn the thought around what the data center means on its head for sure. Right. Yes. And that's, you're right on the point.
Well, the other side of the conversation, speaking of, NIMBYs and the backlash, is this discussion about the environmental footprint of data centers. We had Peter Norvig on recently and one of the pioneers of AI. And back in the day, I think Google had the had one of the questions that was raised is, how much energy is Google consuming to answer all of our search queries, and put ChatGPT into the frame or similar technologies. And people are now worried about the energy consumption of a lot of these technologies. Talk us through some of the concerns and some of the remediations or the alternatives people are looking at when it comes to things like carbon emissions, water usage. People might even be surprised to find out data centers use a considerable amount of water in certain circumstances.
In certain circumstances, for sure. From a design standpoint, and when we're talking about environmental impact, I have to be careful with my words because at the end of the day, if you are, in my humble opinion, if your design is to use millions of gallons of water, fresh water, to cool your space, I think it's a wrong design. I think there are better designs out there to lessen the impact.
Could I pause you though? Because it is fair to say that is not a number that you just made up. There are designs that literally consume considerable amounts of fresh water. Is that correct?
100%. Yeah, it's very correct. It's very correct. There's a better approach, and there are a lot of data center operators out there today that have made those changes to their environments. So the impact, closed loop systems, and et cetera, are lessened because of lessens the water usage. And I think that's one of the biggest core things. From a carbon capture, I think there are a lot of different solutions out there that you can use from a construction standpoint and power generation that almost becomes a non-event. But when you're looking at power consumption and people see this, as you'd mentioned, this big box that is taking all the power, taking all the water, but not giving any impact. There's no impact to the local teams. There's a lot more that a data center, if you're building a gigawatt campus, 500 megawatt campus, that's years worth of work, right? So if you think about what has to happen, you don't just go to a piece of land and start building something. There's lots of planning and interaction with the local economic development councils, local teams, local utilities to get all these things, the infrastructure components there. And then you have to do all the land prep. So ideally, if you're hiring people inside, you try to do as much local hiring as you can to build up the local teams, because eventually, when the construction's done, you move away, you're going to need these teams that understand your space inside and out from a construction standpoint, HVAC standpoint, all the mechanical aspects, electrical, right? So you try to build up that local support as much as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There are quite a few more people that I think that are building and maintaining and operating the space than people realize, but perception in the market is that you have 2 or 3 people. And there are some sites that run dark, but majority of the sites, you need people there all the time. And there are people coming in and out of that space nonstop from a maintenance standpoint.
Yeah, and I'm guessing it's people like, air conditioning mechanics and service people, electricians, plumbing,
plumbers,
I suppose.
Plumbers, yeah, 100%. Landscapers, all the stuff, all the things that you think about, security guards. So yeah, all of the things from a critical. What isn't critical in a data center space? Relating to the mitigation of water, moving water off your roof to get them out of the way so something backs up, right, from a landscaping standpoint.
You just want to get the conversation back to aqueducts, don't you, Scott?
Yeah, I do. Yes, it's amazing. No.
So we'll. I just want to maybe harken back to the environmental conversation. As I say, so I tend to see environment and the political environment going hand in hand because often it's legislative. Are there any steps I could take to reduce the environmental impact of my data center? Are there questions I should be asking you folks, or are there site characteristics that would help me?
Well, anytime you look at a site from a site characteristic standpoint, you have to have, there's certain, I'll say, boxes you have to check from a development standpoint to meet, right? So it all comes down to your design, that early design from that standpoint. Of course, we talked about water usage. Anyone that's asking for the millions of gallons of water, I would have to challenge that design as to why you need that. Of course, that's your core, but why are we taking a look at that from a overall construction standpoint, from a power generation? If you're doing any kind of behind the meter, what are you doing to lessen the impact from a carbon capture standpoint? But there are a lot of different things you can do to mitigate carbon, and I'll say scrub the air, so to speak. So by the time the end product from the exhaust standpoint is basically mist, it's you can completely reduce that. But it comes down to the engineering efforts and what you're willing to expend up front from a capital standpoint to make sure the design and the systems are designed properly to reduce the impact. If you're looking for a quick time to market and the quickest and cheapest down and dirty solution, if you're not truly worried about that, obviously there's going to be a substantial environmental impact if you're not doing the right things and the right measures, if you're not being watched, right? But there's a lot of different steps that you can take with the right design, from behind the meter power generation, and work with your local utility folks, working with your construction teams to make sure that those designs are implemented to reduce. The conversation around the carbon capture and the conversation around what you can do to mitigate environmental impact is fairly substantial in terms of what you do from just a site development standpoint, to standing up the walls, to bringing in all your gear, and to maintaining that space and then the whole life cycle of the data center. And it's a conversation that it might be for a whole nother podcast, that you can say what you can do from a total environment.
I want to wrap up by going a little crazy now. You talked about the need for millions of gallons of water. Where is there a lot of water? I know the ocean. Yeah. And, we saw Microsoft trial a data center that they shoved at the bottom of the ocean. They didn't shove it there. Yeah. That's my words, not theirs.
Yeah.
I don't recall the results of that trial, but certainly they were looking to get innovative about looking at the power and cooling and land usage problem through a slightly different lens.
Mm-hmm.
there's been talk of people moving data centers off planet, speaking about solar, where the sun's always shining because there's no clouds in space. Any of these, I'm going to call them crazy, futuristic, innovative ideas plausible? What are your thoughts on completely thinking outside the box on data centers of the future?
If we're going to utilize water, I think it's completely feasible to utilize, obviously, to have the right systems in place to use seawater from a cooling perspective. I think there are some environments around the world that are pulling water from the ocean and or other lakes, right, to utilize, but the intention is to push that water back into the environment. It might be a half a degree or a little bit warmer, but that also creates a different style environment. When you start looking at areas of the Nordics, right, what they do from a water usage standpoint, and how they use district heating, and that district heating pushes additional things, water usage that's at the data center, use that heat to warm up other environments, but they also use some of the heat for greenhouse type things, and they also use some of the heat to push back into a local bay for lobster farming to create like 1 or 2 degrees difference in the water, and it creates a lobster farm. So it hits things different economically, right? So that's really interesting. When you talk about lunar type things, I think there's complete feasibility. There's a company that we partner with that does lunar and or satellite disaster recovery solutions. So lunar is its own challenge, and you need someone a lot smarter than me to talk about the implications of dropping something on the moon, which I was on Cape Canaveral several weeks ago, and we watched a launch of one of our partner teams, and the payload landed on the moon, and it transmitted. But it comes with an additional set of complications, something sitting on the moon. But the intention was, when it landed on the moon, is maintaining that connection and testing data, right? And making sure you got that connectivity. So that was very successful. But again, other complications that arose. But the second part of that solution is a satellites that will orbit in a certain amount of area of space, cislunar space, that will be utilized for disaster recovery and data resiliency. And the intention is that obviously it doesn't mitigate anything that you have down here from a disaster recovery standpoint. It just adds an additional layer of disaster recovery service and solutions that is a dynamic storage solution, always communicating on a very specific infrastructure, a band network, communicating to these satellites that have petabytes worth of storage. And when you're talking about data sovereignty, when you're talking about disaster recovery, and the mitigation of potential risk of even hacking of items, of stealing, encryption keys or whatever that may be, there is a way to mitigate that through using one of our partners, and it's an incredibly interesting solution. The teams that you get to work with are fascinating, where things are going to go and what they're planning. I'll start with the simple things in terms of satellite system solutions, which makes a lot of sense to me. Then you get to the lunar type applications, which is beyond my thought processing. But you have people like that are doing this, like, I don't know if I can say Lone Star Lunar, that are doing this and thinking long term what that looks like. But it's an incredible solution. The payloads in which they're planning for the satellite solutions are almost all sold out. And the people it's like a lot of NATO-type allied nations, government entities, states, customers, high-level enterprise customers, healthcare, finance, that are purchasing storage, and it gets dynamic, in these secure environments that are completely air-gapped from everything. And it provides this different layer of security that helps you provide and pass audit. So
I love it. I mean, literally air-gapped. There is no air.
Air physically air-gapped on the data center space, because it will land in a data center somewhere, but it's air-gapped in the data centers, completely separate. And then, of course, there's a large air gap there too, space, right? But it's fascinating, and it's something if you think about, I've told you about what Caddis does. Everything we do is very, very physical space, construction, generation, management, operations type. And then you get into this thing that talks about disaster recovery, which sits in space, and something we typically would never get involved in, but meeting the CEO of the team and their technical teams and their passion and what they're doing and their vision, and getting to attend this launch in Cape Canaveral and seeing all of these companies and these people talk about what this means was fascinating, and it was one of the neatest experience I've had over the past in my career. It was really phenomenal.
Scott, you've stimulated a lot of thought for me. I pretty much, as I say, I thought data centers were a matter of getting a a JCB in, scraping some earth, putting up a box and shoving some servers in it, you've certainly
For sure.
challenged that perspective. If people are interested in planning a data center or wanting to know more about the space, where can they go to learn more?
Well, we have a website, caddiscloud.com, that talks about really high level.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. As always, we've got a huge, impressive lineup of guests coming up. So if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss another drop. Thanks again to our friends at Cloudera for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast podcast. And thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. We will see you all, or at least you'll see me next week.
Thank you, Paul.